If you, like us, follow global news, you've probably felt that whiplash, The narrative around Africa. One minute the headlines are all conflict, famine, corruption. That old stark picture, think the Economist's hopeless continent cover from years back?
Hmm.
And then suddenly, the script totally flips. Now it's all about tech booms, demographic dividends, this massive rising middle class, the shiny, almost too simple Africa rising story.
Right. Polar opposites.
Exactly. And that's the core of our deep dive today, this idea that both of these extremes, these binary narratives, are actually, well, they're dangerous, they're reductive, and they really get in the way of genuine understanding.
Yeah, they flatten everything.
So we're diving into a whole stack of critical sources arguing exactly that.
Mm.
Reducing 54 incredibly diverse nations to one single story, whether it's tragedy or triumph. It has real, measurable costs. And you, our listener, know that truth really lives in the complexity, does it? Not in these easy extremes.
Mm. That's our mission today, really, to dig into that complexity. We've found that so much Western commentary it misses the nuance. It swings wildly between tragedy and maybe even more sneakily, this kind of patronizing relativism. There's this myth we need to unpack called Merry Africa.
Merry Africa. Okay, we'll definitely get to that.
We will, because this whole deep dive is about getting past that dangerous simplicity. We're using academic critiques, hard data analysis, even looking at maps, cartographic evidence to show how these stories get built, how they get twisted, and sometimes how they're deliberately weaponized.
So it's not just talk, it's looking at the mechanisms.
Exactly. The material we have today is pretty comprehensive. We've got analyses questioning if metrics like GDP are even the right tools for Africa. We've got campaign info detailing visual bias, literally how we see the continent, and some really rigorous data showing the shocking financial penalties that come from these stereotypes.
Wow. Actual financial penalties.
Yeah. So we're not just, critiquing the media. We're trying to unpack the underlying systems, power, perception that keep these simple binary stories going and actually influencing policy.
Okay, let's start with maybe the most fundamental bias, something that shapes how we see the world, probably long before we even read a news article, the map.
The basic visual.
Specifically, the one map that's been the standard for, nearly 5 centuries, the Mercator projection from 1569.
That old thing, still everywhere.
It is. Most of us grew up with it.
Yeah.
Classrooms, textbooks, probably hanging in UN meeting rooms.
Yeah.
It looks so official. But we know its origin wasn't really about accurate geography, was it?
No, not at all. It was technical. Mercator was brilliant. He solved a huge problem for sailors' navigation. Straight compass bearings on long voyages.
Right. Keeping a straight line on the map meant a constant compass direction. Super useful for ships.
Incredibly useful. But that usefulness came at a huge cost. Massive distortion of scale, especially the further you get from the equator.
And this is where Africa comes in, right?
This is the biggest, most persistent visual lie, you could say. Our sources hammer this point. Look at Greenland versus Africa on a Mercator map. They look, well, roughly the same size, don't they? They take up similar space on the page.
Yeah, visually they seem comparable.
In reality, Africa is 14 times bigger than Greenland. 14. It's larger than China, India, the contiguous U.S., and most of Europe combined, all fitted inside its borders.
14 times. That number is it's staggering when you think about it. When you visually shrink a continent by that much.
You shrink its perceived importance automatically. It makes Africa look smaller, more peripheral, maybe less significant. And that absolutely influences how policies get made, where investment goes, even how aid decisions are framed.
So it's not just an innocent mistake in drawing.
No way. That's why the sources insist. This isn't just a geography issue. It's about narrative. It's about pride, identity, power dynamics. The Mercator map wasn't adopted by accident. Its widespread use happened exactly during the peak of European colonial expansion.
Ah, the timing isn't coincidental.
Not at all. It centered Europe, it artificially inflated Europe's size, and the sailing routes the colonial powers used. And it literally shrunk the equatorial nations, including Africa. It visually reinforced this idea of Africa as, smaller, maybe easier to manage or conquer, less central to the world. It was, as one critique calls it, a powerful instrument of power.
Legitimizing dominance through cartography.
Pretty much. And that visual bias, it's sticky, it persists today, centuries later. It's baked into our global imagination.
So even if we try to move past colonial thinking, The picture in our heads is still based on that old biased map.
Exactly. We're dealing with a visual legacy that keeps Africa mentally small, and that's why there's this real energy now behind the Correct the Map campaign. It's African-led groups like Africa, No Filter, Speak Up Africa, and crucially, it's got backing from the African Union now. This is a conscious pushback.
Okay, so what's the fix? What map are they pushing for instead of Mercator?
They're advocating for the widespread adoption of the Equal Earth projection. It's quite new, only came out in 2018.
Equal Earth. What's special about it?
It elegantly solves the area distortion problem. It shows the continents in their true proportional sizes, so Africa looks massive, as it should. But it does this while keeping the shapes relatively familiar. It corrects the big lie without making the map look totally weird or unusable.
So it's practical, but accurate in scale.
Exactly. And the goal here isn't just, for map nerds or academics. It's a mainstream cultural campaign.
They want it everywhere Mercator is now.
That's the ambition. Get it into schools, into major media outlets, they mentioned the BBC, into multilateral bodies like the UN. The sources argue that for perceptions to really change, this corrected map needs to become part of everyday life.
Because seeing that true scale every day, it forces a different kind of engagement.
It has to. You see the sheer size, the demographic weight, the potential influence of the continent. It demands a more serious, nuanced look rather than just seeing it as this small, peripheral place that needs fixing. It changes the baseline assumption.
Okay, so that visual distortion really sets the stage for the next problem, the economic narrative distortion. Once you've mentally shrunk the continent, maybe it's easier to slap these simple, swinging labels onto its 54 very different economies.
That makes sense.
And the big question driving this seems to be, is life in Africa getting better? But the answers swing wildly between those two poles we started with.
It's almost like a predictable cycle. You had that real low point around 2000 with The Economist and the hopeless continent narrative. That was all about conflict, debt, AIDS crisis. Really bleak.
I remember that cover. It was stark.
And then, just over 10 years later, the narrative completely flips, often pushed by the very same outlets or commentators. By 2011, The Economist is calling Africa hopeful, and you get this flood of literature backed by big institutions like the African Development Bank, all proclaiming Africa rising.
It feels less like careful analysis and more like a narrative overcorrection, or maybe just following a trend.
That's exactly the binary trap in action. The sources really critique this. This literature just boils down the incredible complexity of African economies. You've got everything from emerging giants to really fragile, landlocked states into the simple failure or success choice.
And the real problem gets ignored.
The core problem, critics argue, is that the whole exercise sidesteps the fundamental question. Are the standard Western economic tools, like GDP, even the right way to measure African development at all?
Right. Are we using the right measuring stick? If you measure a sandcastle with tools meant for concrete,
your results are going to be weird, maybe meaningless, and the critique is that this switch from hopeless to hopeful often happens without any real deep dive into the parameters of this rising. The question that constantly gets glossed over is, for whom is Africa actually rising?
Good question. Is it broad-based or just for a specific elite or sector?
Exactly. Critics actually call this sudden wave of positivity reverse propaganda. It's positive spin replacing negative spin, sure, but often using the same potentially flawed conventional metrics, mostly GDP growth figures, which we need to dig into more.
So we're just swapping one overly simple story total crisis for another equally simple one, uncomplicated success. And neither reflects the reality of, say, youth unemployment, inequality, or daily struggles people face.
That's the danger. That's the tragedy, really. The complexity of governing, the tough choices leaders have to make, the real frustrations citizens feel. It all gets drowned out by either doom and gloom or this sort of blind optimism.
And it creates another problem for outsiders looking in, doesn't it?
It does. Our sources point to a deeper issue for, say, Western commentators or analysts. They often struggle to offer genuinely candid, nuanced criticism. If they dare to call out deep dysfunction, like discussing Nigeria being labeled a failed state, by some metrics they risk getting slammed for being condescending, neo-colonial, or just falling back into that old hopeless trope.
So there's a pressure not to be too critical, the fear of being called like a neo-colonial headmaster.
Absolutely. And that pressure can push the analysis towards these overly rosy, generalized statements that just don't match the lived experience of people dealing with insecurity or failing institutions or the rising cost of living It can feel like a form of narrative gaslighting.
Gaslighting, how so?
Well, Africans themselves often want constructive criticism. They want genuine concern, not just dismissal. And they definitely want the world to acknowledge their real anxieties and suffering, which the relentless Africa Rising story can seem to ignore or minimize. Simplistic positivity can feel like a denial of their actual problems. And that failure to really engage with the difficult realities, it leads us straight into the second big narrative trap. This one often props up the Africa Rising story in a weird way. It's what the sources call the patronizing logic of relativism.
Relativism, you mean like saying Western standards just don't apply?
Sort of, but in a really insidious, damaging way. Our sources trace this idea back to something called the myth of Merry Africa. It's got roots deep in the colonial era. Works like Mistaking Africa detail this.
Merry Africa,
Yeah.
like happy Africa.
Yeah, the myth basically suggests that African people are somehow uniquely culturally conditioned to find joy in simple things, that they have this innate happiness, this spiritual resilience that lets them thrive even amid terrible adversity. And
Therefore, we shouldn't judge their situation by our standards or
Yeah.
expect the same thing.
Exactly. It implies they shouldn't be judged by, tough Western metrics of governance or wealth or even human rights because they're different. They're happy anyway.
Wow. That's incredibly patronizing and dangerous. It basically gives a free pass to poor governance or bad conditions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, they're happy, don't worry about it.
Yeah. It's profoundly dangerous. It minimizes genuinely terrible conditions. It sweeps problems under the rug as just the unavoidable travails of developmental infancy, instead of seeing them as systemic failures that need urgent attention or real critique. It's this soft bigotry suggesting Africans don't want or deserve the same standards of life, opportunity, stability as everyone else. If you think they're just perpetually merry, why bother fixing the systemic problems?
Okay, I see the danger there. And you mentioned earlier that part of what fuels this is how we measure development, using flawed tools like GDP and GNP. We touched on it, but how bad is the measurement problem?
It's pervasive. First off, the whole idea of economic development itself has shifted constantly. After World War II, it meant modernization, then it just meant growth, then poverty reduction, then we got the Millennium Development Goals. The target keeps moving.
But the main tool, GDP, stayed the same.
Largely, yes. And GDP is often totally disconnected from economic reality in many African contexts, mainly because it famously ignores the massive, absolutely vital informal sector.
Right, the unregistered businesses, the local markets, subsistence farming. That's the lifeblood for millions, isn't it?
For the vast majority in many countries, GDP is mostly designed to track formal stuff. Big companies, banks, registered employment. It completely misses the enormous value created in the informal economy.
Is there a clear example of this mismatch?
Oh, a classic one is Ghana back in 2010. The government statistically rebased its GDP calculation. Basically, they updated the methods to finally include activities they'd previously overlooked, especially in the services sector.
Okay, so they tried to make the number more accurate. What happened?
Overnight, Ghana's official GDP jumped by an unbelievable 69%. 69%. Statistically, on paper, the country leaped from being low income to lower middle income, just like that. A huge success story, right?
On paper, yes, but I have a feeling the average person selling tomatoes in Accra Market didn't suddenly feel 69% richer.
Not even close. The sources are crystal clear on this. For ordinary Ghanaians, especially the huge youth population, there was virtually no real tangible change in their economic situation. It was a perfect case of jobless growth. The official number looked great, the metric was satisfied, but it didn't translate into well-being for most people.
So the metric itself drives policy towards things that boost the number, even if it doesn't help the population.
That's the risk. It can incentivize focusing only on the formal, easily measured parts of the economy, potentially neglecting the welfare of the majority operating informally.
Okay, if GDP is so flawed, maybe even counterproductive, what alternatives do the sources suggest? How can we get a better sense of actual well-being?
This is where we get into subjective well-being measures, particularly the happiness index or similar surveys. Psychologists tend to prefer this approach, unlike economists who often get fixated on objective proxies like income.
So instead of measuring money, you just ask people how they feel.
Essentially, yes. You focus on self-reported subjective well-being. They measure things like positive effect, how many positive emotions do you feel day to day? Life satisfaction, how do you rate your life overall? And the absence of negative states, like stress, it goes back to Aristotle. Really, happiness is the ultimate goal, not just wealth.
Okay, and what happens when you apply this kind of measurement in African countries? Does it match the hopeless narrative?
Not at all. The results are genuinely startling, sometimes completely flipping the script. When researchers looked at self-reported data on leading a purposeful life, asking people if they feel their life has made time, meaning African nations actually dominated the global top 20.
Really?
Which ones? Liberia, a country we often associate with immense hardship and recovery, was ranked #1 globally. 100% of respondents there felt they had a purposeful life. Sierra Leone ranked higher on this measure than wealthy nations like the US, the UK, and Norway.
Wow, that's a powerful contrast. Struggling by conventional economic metrics, but ranking top in perceived purpose. What does that tell us?
It forces us to confront our own definitions of success and development, doesn't it? Now, we need caution. Purposeful life isn't exactly the same as moment-to-moment happiness, though they're strongly correlated. But these findings raise huge questions.
Like, are we overvaluing money?
Perhaps, or at least overvaluing purely monetary, secular, individualistic measures of progress. The data suggests that high feelings of purpose correlate strongly with things like community, kindness, sharing, togetherness, collective values. Maybe those are being sacrificed in wealthier nations chasing, what, GDP growth?
It makes you think of that condition people sometimes call affluenza, this stress and dissatisfaction that can come with material wealth in developed countries.
Yeah.
The endless chase.
Exactly. Adam Smith even wrote about it in his Parable of the Poor Man's Son. The guy works his whole life for trinkets and status, sacrificing simple joys along the way. Maybe we're applying that flawed logic on a global scale.
And this lack of good data, or maybe using the wrong kind of data, it connects back to a bigger problem you mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. This whole discussion circles back to the deep, damaging issue of data scarcity and bias across the continent.
How does not having enough data, or the right data, feed these bad narratives?
Well, the Reddit discussions our sources looked at really highlight this. When there isn't enough comprehensive, reliable, local data, it creates a vacuum. And into that vacuum rush the simple, easy narratives because commentators don't have the nuanced information they need.
So ignorance breeds stereotypes.
Pretty much. And worse, there can be a bias in what data gets collected. You might see huge international efforts to gather certain kinds of data, maybe sensitive stuff like IQ scores across the continent, or disease prevalence data that can sometimes fit the negative stereotypes, making countries look bad. But then, comprehensive surveys on what people actually believe or how satisfied they are with their lives, like the purpose data we just discussed, those might only cover a handful of countries, say 7 out of 54. You simply cannot generalize about an entire, vast, diverse continent based on such tiny samples, but it allows people to fill in the blanks with whatever story fits their pre-existing bias.
Okay, so if our standard metrics for success are shaky, let's look at something very tangible. Africa's incredible natural wealth. This is a huge part of the economic story that the simple, hopeless, or rising narratives often just gloss over or get wrong.
Absolutely. The continent is incredibly resource-rich. Oil, gas, diamonds, cobalt, fertile land, you name it. But paradoxically, this wealth often seems to bring more problems than prosperity. That's the famous resource curse.
Also called Dutch disease or the paradox of plenty.
Exactly. It's this bizarre phenomenon where countries rich in natural resources often end up with lower economic stability, more conflict, and more authoritarian governments compared to their resource-poor neighbors.
It seems totally backwards. How does having more wealth lead to more instability?
It's complicated, involving both internal political dynamics and external factors. But let's first clarify the conflict aspect, because even that defies simple narratives. Conflict related to resources often takes two main forms.
Okay.
First, you have conflict driven by scarcity. This happens where resources are dwindling, maybe water, grazing land due to climate change, population pressure, or unequal access. Think of Turkana County in Kenya, where there's ongoing conflict over scarce water and pasture. That's fighting because there isn't enough.
Right. Classic resource competition.
But the second type, the one really linked to the resource curse, is conflict driven by abundance. This is what you see in places like the DRC, with its vast mineral wealth, or Nigeria with its oil. Here, the fighting isn't because the resources are scarce. It's an intense, often violent struggle over who gets to control the massive revenues generated by those abundant resources.
So it's a fight for the cash flow, for the power the money brings.
Precisely. It's about controlling the state apparatus that controls the resource wealth. So let's dig into the internal mechanisms. Why doesn't this wealth translate into development for ordinary people?
Yeah. What happens inside these countries?
Internally, the curse really thrives on corruption and the breakdown of the social contract between the government and the citizens. Two key terms here are rent-seeking and rent-seizing.
Rent-seeking. That sounds familiar.
Rent-seeking is basically different groups, political factions, ethnic groups, military coups fighting, bribing, lobbying, doing whatever it takes to get their hands on a slice of the resource revenue pie. It's competing for existing wealth, not creating new wealth.
Okay, competing for the spoils. What's rent-seizing?
Rent-seizing is arguably even worse. This is when the people already empower political leaders. Officials actively dismantle checks and balances. They change laws, create opaque procedures, specifically to give themselves and their friends direct, unfettered access to those resource revenues. It makes corruption systemic, part of the design.
So it's not just skimming off the top, it's redesigning the system to enable looting.
That's a good way to put it. And think about what this does to governance. If a government gets most of its money from oil exports or diamond sales, rather than from taxing its own citizens, what happens to accountability?
They don't need the citizens as much. If the money comes from the ground, not from taxes, they're less reliant on keeping people happy or providing services in return for taxes.
Exactly. That's the core political damage. The government gets unearned income, as economists call it. It makes them less dependent on public consent, less responsive to public needs. They don't need a robust tax base. They just need to control the resource tap. This breeds authoritarianism. Nigeria is often cited here, decades of huge oil wealth, massive GDP figures on paper, yet poverty rates in oil-rich states are often higher, infrastructure lags. The accountability just isn't there. Classic jobless growth again.
Okay, that's the internal rot. But you said external factors play a role too, legacy issues.
Absolutely. There's the historical legacy of exploitative contracts signed with multinational corporations, often decades ago, under very different power dynamics. These can lock countries into unfavorable terms for extracting their own resources.
And more recently.
More recently, it's about reliance on huge foreign loans, especially from non-Western partners like China. Chinese lending to Africa surged massively in the years leading up to 2017. These loans often look attractive, maybe fewer conditions attached initially.
But the collateral can be.
The collateral can be the resources themselves or strategic assets. We've seen examples where countries like Angola end up repaying loans by simply shipping fixed amounts of oil directly to the lender. Or concerns arise when big infrastructure projects like Kenya's standard gauge railway don't generate the expected revenue to repay the loans. There's a real fear of foreign entities potentially seizing ports, railways, or resource concessions if debts aren't repaid.
The infamous debt trap scenario.
Exactly. It risks undermining national sovereignty over resources and assets, creating a new form of external dependence.
Okay, so the curse is complex, driven by internal governance failures and external pressures. But it's not inevitable, right? Are there pathways out, success stories?
Definitely not inevitable. It's fundamentally a governance challenge. And the absolute classic success story, the one everyone points to, is Botswana.
Botswana and diamonds.
Right. When they gained independence in 1966, they were one of the poorest countries on Earth. But they discovered diamonds, and crucially, they managed that wealth incredibly well. Transparent institutions, very low corruption.
What was their key strategy? Just saving the money?
Not just saving, they were very disciplined about investing the diamond revenue into future-oriented assets. Building up financial reserves, yes, to cushion against diamond price fluctuations. But critically, huge investments in education, health, infrastructure, building human capital, and diversifying the economy for the long term. They avoided splurging on immediate consumption or splashy, unproductive legacy projects.
So good governance plus smart long-term investment. Intergenerational thinking.
That's the heart of it. So the policy lessons are clear. First, diversifying the economy away from just relying on exporting raw resources is absolutely critical.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Second, countries need the power and the political will to review and renegotiate those old, potentially exploitative contracts. Tanzania's Minerals Act of 2017 is a really interesting example here. It explicitly gave their parliament the power to look at existing mining contracts and challenge terms deemed unconscionable or grossly unfair to the nation. That's about reclaiming sovereignty.
Taking back control. And underlying all this, there must be a need for local expertise.
Absolutely vital. The sources stress the urgent need for massive, sustained investment in science, technology, and innovation within Africa. Right now, the continent produces something like only 1% of the world's scientific knowledge output.
Only 1%. Wow.
Yeah. If you can't innovate, if you can't develop the technology to process your own resources to add value yourself, you remain stuck just exporting raw materials. Overcoming the resource curse isn't just about economic policy, it's about building intellectual independence and capability, too.
Okay, let's bring this all back to how these complex realities, the map distortion, the flawed economics, the resource curse get filtered to us, the global audience, back to the media.
Right, the front lines of narrative construction.
And Chimamanda Adishi's famous warning about the danger of a single story feels so relevant here because the media seems to constantly reinforce those binaries we started with.
It really does. The sources identify this deeply ingrained pattern of predictable negative tropes that dominate international coverage of Africa. There's the relentless focus on political and financial corruption, which exists, of course, but is often presented without context, without comparison at global levels, almost as if it's uniquely African.
And the poverty imagery.
Oh yeah, the visual shorthand. The flies on children's faces. The sprawling shantytowns, emaciated figures. Imagery designed for immediate simplistic pity, not understanding.
And conflict, how's that usually framed?
Complex civil wars, disputes over land or resources, political struggles, they often get boiled down to just tribal wars. That phrase itself suggests something ancient, irrational, maybe inevitable, defying any need for deeper political or economic explanation.
It strips away the context.
Completely. And perhaps the most damaging trope is the erasure of African agency. Africans are so often portrayed as passive victims,
Right.
just waiting for Western aid, Western intervention, Western experts to come and solve their problems, bystanders in their own story.
So no initiative, no solutions coming from within.
Rarely highlighted in mainstream coverage. And even when there are positive stories, they tend to follow a very specific script.
What's the script?
It's usually about individual success against the odds. The lone entrepreneur, the brilliant student, the farmer who makes it despite the system. It fits nicely with a kind of neoliberal focus on individual achievement.
But not stories about, say, successful government programs or community initiatives.
Much less common. And you rarely see Africans portrayed using complex technology, leading cutting-edge urban development. The visual default remains rural or struggling, reinforcing that image of perpetual underdevelopment.
Why? Why is it so hard for media outlets to break out of these ruts? Why stick to the extremes?
Well, a lot of it boils down to commercial reality. Journalism, especially international news, is largely treated as a commodity now. It's driven by the ratings game, by clicks, by views.
So sensation sells.
Sensation and sentiment sell. Headline-grabbing stories are prioritized over nuance and context. A dramatic story about war or corruption is simply easier to package and sell globally than a complicated analysis of, say, Botswana's sovereign wealth fund strategy.
And the speed of news doesn't help.
Not at all. The demand for instant news, for immediacy, leads to what the sources call fly-by-night journalism. Reporters often don't have the time, the resources, or sometimes even the deep local knowledge to provide proper context. So what do? They fall back on the familiar, easily recognizable tropes. Stereotypes become a shortcut.
Okay, so the stereotypes persist because they're convenient and commercially viable. But this leads us to maybe the most shocking point in our sources. The actual measurable financial cost of these stereotypes. This isn't just about bad PR, it's costing billions.
This is the crux of it, really, the prejudice premium. Rigorous financial analysis has calculated that African countries collectively lose up to £3.2 billion every single year.
3.2 billion pounds. How? In what form?
In the form of inflated interest payments on their government debt, their sovereign bonds.
So they're paying more to borrow money simply because of stereotypes.
That's exactly the mechanism. The relentless media focus on conflict, corruption, instability. The single negative story creates a deep-seated perception of higher risk across the entire continent in the minds of international lenders and investors.
So even if a specific country, let's say Ghana or Rwanda, has its books in decent order, a manageable debt level, good growth prospects, they still get penalized by this broad brush African risk perception.
Precisely. That generalized, often unjustified perception of risk creates this prejudice premium. Lenders, banks, bondholders, investment funds demand higher interest rates on loans to African governments than the underlying economic fundamentals might actually warrant. It's literally a financial penalty paid for a bad reputation fueled by simplistic media coverage.
A $3.2 billion annual penalty. What could that money do if it wasn't going to inflate the interest payments?
The opportunity cost is just staggering. It's real money that could be transforming lives. £3.2 billion could pay for the education of over 12 million children annually, or it could provide clean drinking water to two-thirds of Nigeria's entire population. That financial drain is a direct, quantifiable consequence of the single story.
That's infuriating. Is there any pushback against this? Are African countries just accepting these biased ratings?
No, there's growing frustration and a real move towards reclaiming agency here. They're tired of the slow pace of global financial reform, tired of being judged solely by international rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, S&P, which often perpetuate this risk premium.
What are they doing about it?
The African Union is taking a major strategic step. They're actively working to establish their own Africa Credit Rating Agency, or ACRA.
An African agency to rate African debt.
Exactly. The explicit goal is to provide sovereign risk analysis that is regionally based, locally informed, and challenges what they see as the inherent pessimistic assumptions baked into the models of the big international agencies, which often have very limited physical presence on the ground and rely heavily on those external, often biased media narratives.
That sounds like a big deal. But will the big international agencies or global finance even pay attention to a new regional agency? Can ACRA actually gain traction?
That's the key question, and the sources suggest it'll be a fight. It's a test of financial sovereignty. ACRA's real clout will depend on whether African institutions themselves, the big pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, regional banks, start using ACRA's ratings as their primary benchmark. If they do, it could create a parallel financial ecosystem less beholden to external judgment.
So it's an attempt to change the rules of the game, to bypass the prejudice premium by creating their own trusted assessor.
Precisely. It's a direct shot at reclaiming control over their financial narrative and, hopefully, clawing back some of that $3.2 billion annual loss by fundamentally changing how risk is assessed. #tag outro. So as we wrap up this deep dive, the core challenge for you, the listener, is clear, isn't it? Getting a real understanding of Africa means pushing past those easy, simple extremes, the hopeless failure on one side, the sort of romanticized, resilient success on the other. Both hide the messy, complex truth.
Yeah, the reality is definitely in the middle, in the nuance.
And finding that nuance means actively doing a few things we've talked about. Rejecting the visual lie of the Mercator map. Questioning those standard growth metrics like GDP that just don't capture the full picture of lived experience. Getting our heads around the complexities, internal and external, of the resource curse.
And crucially, recognizing that the single story peddled by media isn't just inaccurate. It has that massive, real-world financial cost, the prejudice premium.
Exactly. True understanding demands that complexity.
And it leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought, actually. Something for you to chew on, based directly on that surprising data about well-being we discussed.
The happiness and purpose data.
Right. If people living in African countries, often deemed poor or struggling by our standard Western economic metrics, countries facing real challenges with stability or governance, if they consistently report higher levels of feeling their lives have purpose, higher levels of life satisfaction in some cases, than populations in wealthy, developed nations.
Yeah.
Nations perhaps suffering from that stress of affluenza. Then, should our main global focus really be entirely on fixing their perceived economic failure according to our models? Or do we maybe need to pause first and seriously question the very definition of success and development that we apply, not just to them, but maybe even to ourselves?
A fundamental question.
What are we actually measuring when we talk about progress? And why have we let that specific, often purely economic definition become the only game in town, potentially eclipsing things like community, connection, or even just human purpose? What are we really chasing?